Hi, my name is Deirdre Chance, and this is my video response 2 for Counseling 6323 for crisis response and trauma counseling. So I'm looking at how do we, as crisis care workers, respond to disaster in the different phases. We're going to look at the heroic phase, and normally during the heroic phase, an earlier phase of disasters, people are energized due to the high level of need. People are coming together. The benefit of that is there is this heightened sense of community and belonging. There is often a heightened sensitivity to the Lord and greater openness to spirituality as well. But it reminds me a lot of like an adrenaline rush, like when we first see something that's important and meaningful to us and in need and in crisis, right? We get that rush of energy, and there can be a lot of positives with that. However, there's also cons to this heightened level of energy. It's not sustainable. So the energy level can become overwhelming. People can lose sight of balance and and to have a long view of the disaster. They forget not only balance, but also to take time off, to take care of themselves. Normally in the heroic stage, instead, they are throwing themselves into the needs, into the crisis work. And often, again, they need to grow in just having that long-term view. It's likely that people in this stage may have denial of the gravity and enormity of the disaster. And some of that is survival techniques, needed coping skills in the midst of survival. Right? Perhaps if when we're in the midst of disaster, if we fully faced all the gravity and enormity, we might freeze up and not be able to be energized to meet the needs. So while it's something to balance and consider the challenges, there's some benefit of surviving and just being able to meet the immediacy needs in this phase. In the honeymoon phase, that happens once the heroic phase stops. It can often be referred to as a crash point. First there are some good things. There's great gratitude. There's a view that everything will be okay. A lot of times there'll be a focus on these feel-good stories that emerge, as well as a focus on the validation of normalcy. But at some point, people crash. As time continues and the crisis workers and the survivors become worn out and exhausted, they just physically crash. And that's part of the honeymoon phase. This can happen to not only the crisis caregivers, but also the survivors. Using the example of Hurricane Katrina and the areas impacted by that, there were thousands of people killed. So those survivors and those, again, giving care to the survivors are impacted in this stage. Why this happens? This stage can seem like a warm, fuzzy stage, but reality isn't always warm, fuzzy. People, again, they become physically worn out. Reality can't stay in that overly idealistic adrenaline energized level, that people become worn out, and they can even start to experience psychosomatic systems. Again, in the example with Hurricane Katrina, survivors and care workers were going to the hospital with symptoms of heart problems, where really it was a psychosomatic sign that psychologically, emotionally, they were getting drained and worn out. So those are some of the descriptions of the crash point in the honeymoon phase. The next phase, the disillusionment phase, there can be a time where a lot of fear, anger, and hopelessness set in. Some of the clinical conditions that may develop during this phase, of course, include trauma-related disorders like post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. The needs in this phase may go on for years. And the goal in this phase is to really move people to that post-traumatic growth. So that can occur through celebrating growth wherever you see it. You know, again, this phase can go on for years. So it's important to celebrate growth, especially in addressing trauma-related disorders. It's important to celebrate growth both as individuals and as communities whenever you see growth taking place and happening, to celebrate that. There's been some evidence and reports that suggests that it may take 20 years for a community that's been impacted by disaster, such as the area around New Orleans that was impacted by Hurricane Katrina, that community area will likely take 20 years to get back to what they were pre-disaster. And then for individuals, it may even take a lifetime. So again, to have that long view, and then as people are dealing with trauma-related disorders, such as PTSD, to when treatment, intervention, ongoing effort that can help treat that is celebrating the post-traumatic growth. Trauma-related disorders like PTSD are not the only conditions that may develop from disasters. Addictions, there are often a rise in addictions, many of those co-occurring disorders related to the trauma. Community violence also often increases, as well as intimate partner violence. Treatment and interventions that are helpful, that are shown to be efficacious for disaster counseling and crisis counseling. The first one would be debriefing. That's normally a first response treatment intervention. Also doing trainings for grief, and this can, some of that can, the training for how to do grief counseling can occur in the pre-stages of disasters to prepare in advance. I think once a community, oftentimes it's in our conscious level that we need to prepare for disaster and crisis counseling before the disaster hits. But after it hits, you realize maybe the gaps. So many of the treatment and interventions will be have more positive outcomes the more that treatments and interventions can be prepared for in advance. So developing disaster plans, developing Bible studies around spiritual disaster preparedness, to help people with that spiritual side where we struggle with meaning and connectedness, spiritual dissonance, having multiple technical ways of communication is a great intervention, something, again, that is augmented when you prepare in advance for it. Collaborating with other churches to provide places of evacuation and safety, and to carry on life necessities work. To know and build relationships with local resources, again, to prepare for that in the pre-stages, so that when disaster happens, those relationships and networking with resources that are already involved in the community can happen more quickly and efficiently, and people can benefit from those resources that are already in place locally. Helping parents to prepare with kids, helping other individuals to prepare. can help build resiliency. And again, to just normalize life, like, okay, we've prepared for this, we know what to do. In the moment interventions and treatments would be to, first of all, respond to disaster and to survivors by addressing the safety and physical needs. Just like Maslow's well-known hierarchy of needs, you have to start with the physical and safety needs first. Back to sort of the pre-stages to fundraise, so that funds are there, physical resources are there. Again, those collaborative relationships are there to be able to meet those safety and physical needs. Another intervention is to start off with surveying survivors for PTSD. Using psychological first aid is another intervention. It's often considered a first order crisis counseling intervention. It focuses on several steps: stabilizing the client, right? Making contact and engaging the client, providing safety and comfort, all those efforts to stabilize the client. And then gathering information to be able to provide practical assistance and social supports, as well as giving information for coping to survivors, and then making those connections to collaborative sources, like for longer term mental health counseling if needed. Sometimes disaster counselors, just the catharsis of talking and having someone listen and be that support is all they need. Sometimes they'll need that collaboration. So psychological first aid, again, is a first order crisis counseling intervention that's empirically based model and framework for crisis counseling. Along with that, making referrals to medical or health agencies for the client's need, making plans for long-term recovery, preparing Bible studies on recovery, to provide hope and healing in Christ. Often, if the crisis worker is a Christian and has been coming along and serving these individuals, there's an openness, even an indebtedness to hear from the crisis workers about faith. There's also programs like the American Red Cross called Neighbor to Neighbor that can help provide stabilization and mental health therapy, as well as suicide prevention. So these are some specifics with disaster counseling. I used Houston Christian University's video on the needs and challenges of disaster for this video, as well as Miller's Fundamentals of Crisis Counseling from 2012. Thank you.